On the day of January 1st, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation just as the country was about to enter its third year of a deadly civil war. All persons held as slaves within the rebelling states are and henceforth shall be free, as according to the Emancipation Proclamation. Abolitionists and radical Republicans put pressure on Abraham Lincoln to issue an Emancipation Proclamation almost immediately upon the state of his presidency. Lincoln genuinely detested slavery, but he felt constrained by the president's constitutional rights to oppose slavery only in the context of essential wartime actions. Additionally, he was concerned about how people in the border states that supported slavery would respond. Lincoln is credited with stating, "I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky," which perfectly captures the significance of retaining the border states in the Union. In a speech said by Lincoln, he said, "I have always hated slavery, I think as much as any abolitionist. I have been an old line Whig. I have always hated it, but I have always been quiet about it until this new era of the introduction of the Nebraska Bill began. I always believed that everybody was against it, and that it was in course of ultimate extinction." Although there were multiple limitations on the Emancipation Proclamation, slavery in the border states that remained loyal to the U.S. were unaffected because it only pertained to those that had broken away from the U.S. Also, it excluded southern secessionist states already under the Northern Authority from being considered part of the Confederacy. Most importantly, the promise of freedom was contingent on the military success of the Union, which would be the United States. Lincoln's struggle to preserve the Union was fueled by the southern states' desire to maintain the system of slavery while they seceded. President Lincoln was persuaded to free all of the enslaved individuals in the country by Frederick Douglass and other powerful black men and women abolitionists. Fire must be met with water, darkness with light, and war for the destruction of liberty must be met with war for the destruction of slavery, abolitionist Frederick Douglass once said. Additionally, he supported black males enlisting in the military and fighting for their liberation. Douglass believed that military service would guarantee Union victory and provide former slaves with a route to citizenship. With the emancipation of slaves, Lincoln thought that former slaves would have joined the Union and helped defeat the Confederacy. Abolitionist John Brown led a raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia in 1859, with the goal of arming slaves for a rebellion against their owners. While Brown's raid was swiftly suppressed, it had profound consequences. It heightened tensions between the North and South as Southerners viewed it as evidence of a North conspiracy against slavery. In the North, some saw Brown as a martyr for anti-slaves cause. The raid intensified the sectional divide and contributed to the growing sense that the nation was on the brink of major conflict over the issue of slavery. Abolitionist John Brown led the Harper's Ferry raid, which took place in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, now West Virginia, on October 16th to the 18th in 1859. Brown and a few of his supporters sought to take control of Harper's Ferry's government armory in order to start a slave uprising. Colonel Robert E. Lee, U.S. Marines, and fierce opposition from neighborhood militias caused the plan to fall apart very fast. Eventually, Brown and his supporters were taken into custody. The raid had a profound effect on the country and raised tensions over slavery between the North and South. Although Brown's actions were widely denounced in the South and stoked fears of slavery insurrection, some abolitionists saw him as a martyr. Since the Harper's Ferry raid brought alight the enduring differences between the northern and southern states, it is frequently cited as a prelude in the American Civil War. After that, John Brown was put on trial for treason, found guilty, and put to death. In the Dred Scott v. Stanford case, the Supreme Court ruled in 1857 that enslaved individuals were not considered citizens and that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in the territories. Impact. The decision was a blow on the anti-slavery movement as it invalidated the idea that Congress could restrict the spread of slavery. It also heightened tensions between the North and South, further polarizing the nation along sectional lines. The decision fueled the abolitionist movement, solidified Southern resistance to anti-slavery measures, and contributed to the Civil War's eventual outbreak. The 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was proposed in 1865 and ratified later that year. It abolished slavery throughout the United States. The amendment marked the official and permanent end of slavery in the United States. It was a direct response to the Emancipation Proclamation and solidified the legal foundation for the freedom of all slaves. The 13th Amendment represented a crucial step in transforming the nation by constitutionally erecting the institution of slavery. It fulfilled the promises of the Emancipation Proclamation and set the stage for the Reconstruction era. Life for slaves before the Emancipation Proclamation was depressing and cruel. Working 6 days a week from sunrise to sunset and occasionally eating food unfit for an animal were the realities of life on the fields. Small shacks with a dirt floor and little to no furniture were the houses of plantation slaves. Often, the worst was life on big plantations under a harsh overseer. Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 on September 18, 1850, as a component of the Compromise of 1850. Even in free states, the act mandated that slaves be returned to their masters. Additionally, the act tasked the federal government with tracking down, bringing back, and prosecuting runaway slaves. This mandated that citizens of free states assisted in apprehending fugitive slaves. Those who assisted runaway slaves risked treason charges, a $1,000 fine, and 6 months in prison. A distinct legal structure was also formed by the law to handle accusations against fugitives. The proclamation expanded the objectives of the Union military effort by explicitly designating the abolition of slavery as a global alongside national unity. In numerous ways, the Emancipation Proclamation was restricted even with its broad language. Slavery in the border states that remained loyal was unaffected because it only applied to those that had broken away from the Union. Additionally, it specifically included Confederate areas that were already ruled by the North. Above all, the promise of freedom was contingent on Union military triumph. Black codes were also implied to stop the Emancipation Proclamation from being executed. Black codes like the literacy test, grandfather clause, and poll tax were all black codes that had limited African American rights. The literacy exams would prevent people of color and occasionally poor white people from exercising their right to vote. The easiest test questions, such as who is the President of the United States, may be asked if the official desire of the test taker to pass. The grandfather clause was a method employed by several states to prevent slave descendants from voting. Most people whose ancestors were slaves, this meant that you could not vote unless your grandpa had done so. There was a discussion over this unequal treatment in the press, in Congress, and on the streets. Poll taxes were taxes that were put in African Americans if they wanted to vote. A lot of states in the South imposed poll taxes in an attempt to prevent Black Americans from casting ballots. Thus, a large amount of African Americans, as well as other poor citizens who were unable to pay poll tax, lost their ability to vote and their citizenship. The Emancipation Proclamation fostered a mindset in which the abolition of slavery was viewed as one of the main goals of the conflict. The North now appeared to have the most moral cause abroad. The foreign government's populace might resist even if it wished to step in favor of the South. Although very few slaves were actually released by the proclamation, it was the end of slavery in the United States. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution was eventually proposed and ratified as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation, thereby outlawing slavery nationwide. For slaves, this was a big step in allowing them to become permanently free without any restrictions. The owners of enslaved individuals received compensation from the federal government for their loss of property. Those who were let free received neither compensation nor help in making the adjustments to their newfound freedom. The Senate deliberated the Confiscation Act, a wartime measure intended to enable the federal government to acquire property, including slave property, that was being used to finance the Confederate insurrection during its extraordinary session that took place from July 4th to August 6, 1861. For the slave owners, due to the Southern economy's reliance on slave labor, they encountered economic difficulties as a result of the loss of their labor force. There was opposition in the Declaration, with some slave owners refusing to follow the decree. The South's social structure changed significantly as free slaves fought for their rights and saw opportunity. Slave property was occasionally seized by Union forces, which had an additional negative effect on Southern culture. The proclamation deliberately sought to undermine the economic and social underpinnings of the Confederate war effort. In the end, it cleared the path for the 13th Amendment ratification in 1865, which abolished slavery.